So I get asked often enough how to repair cracks. Fairly simple process. This video that I put together is basically how you would fix 90% of the cracks out there. The only variation would be the texture. This house happens to be suspected 100 years of paint over sand, which makes it look kind of like a orange peel, but it's very uneven. So we're just going through the whole place and fixing everything, and then everything's going to get sprayed. But if you had sand, you would roll like a sand texture over it. If it was smooth, you would just leave it. And there's various other textures. I'm not going to get into that. This is just simply fixing the crack. This specific crack is suspected water damage. So the first thing you got to do is you got to dig out everything that's loose. Take your razor, dig everything out, assess it. Also, you're going to want to cover up any trim or glass or floor, because you are going to make a mess. A good policy, especially in these fancy pants mansions, is to not get kills and crap all over the super expensive marble fireplace that is irreplaceable, because you can't afford to fix it. So, since it's suspected water damage, dig out all the loose crap that's in there. Then what you do is you roll like an oil-based guards or kills over it to neutralize the surface. If you don't do this, it'll probably delaminate, probably blister out further. And make sure everything that you're painting over is solid. Very important that you scrape it first, because the oil-based kills and the materials that you put on there will only stick as good as whatever it's sticking to. So if the paint and everything underneath it is loose, it will just completely crack right off. Once you've done that, everything's dried. Go around with like a bag mix mud. Not the bucket mix, that stuff's crap. Unless you're doing like a finish coat or corners, but for, like I said, for a crack, use hard mud. Pre-fill everything before meshing it. You want your mesh to be kind of closer to the top of the repair. If it's like super deep, you want to do all your pre-fill before you put any kind of a mesh on it. Then once you've done your pre-fill, if it's a lot of pre-fill, sometimes you want to let that get hard and then scrape it off before putting all your mesh on, because if you don't, it's going to kind of pudge out and turn it into a volcano. This crack wasn't too terrible. So once I got the pre-fill on, did a little bit of mesh, then fill it out with a knife just to get the mesh coated. And again, it's important to let all these steps dry in between, because if you don't let it dry in between, what will happen is it's going to want to bubble, it's going to want to laminate, it'll separate. So let each coat in between dry mostly or completely, especially on the edges. Then once you're done, you can work on flattening it out. Now, I'm a little bit of a weirdo. Basically, my background is more in plaster, so for flattening things out, I tend to use my absolute favorite trowel, which is a Marshalltown. I have sizes ranging all the way from 4 inches all the way up to 20 inches. And if that's not big enough, then I use my Derby. And if that's not big enough, I try to find a rod, a 6-foot rod. And if that's not big enough, I have used 2x4s or 2x6s to really flatten out bad spots. And if that's not big enough, I tell the homeowner to live with it, because that's ridiculous. But for most cracks, you're not going to really fill it. What you're gonna do is you're not gonna want to make it any worse. You're gonna want to keep where, if it's like a volcano, like this one is slightly, you're gonna want to kind of roll it. So when the light hits it, it's not just a sharp edge. It just rolls over the side of it, and it just blends into the wall. And this wall happens to have a lot of variation in it because it's old school plaster. The old school plaster walls are not flat. So all we're really trying to do is roll it so you don't see the repair. So I like to use, for this one, I used a Marshalltown 16-inch trowel. Tapers are going to use Pana knife, which is nothing wrong with that, but like I said, with the trowel, it's a little bit harder to use, but it has a long shank on it, so it doesn't flex as much. It's got a teeny tiny bit of a bend for troweling out walls and stuff, so you don't have a bunch of let-off lines. But also keep in mind it's a lot easier to add later than it is to sand or scrape off any excess material that you have. Worst case scenario, it's not the end of the world if you leave like a line, a little trawl line, you can scrape it off and fill it later. The point here is just kind of getting your shape down. You're not really trying to get it smooth at this point. You're just getting it shaped. Once you're done with that, take your knife, scrape any high points off of the wall that you may have. Also, mix up, this is the only time that I use bucket mud, like finished mud. For this I used a light blue material, which is sands very easily. Hard mud does not sand well, but it is a lot stronger. The topping mud is exactly that. You put it right on the top. It's much more buttery, so it leaves a nicer finish, and it sands easier. You should be able to grind in the edges a lot better, so you don't see the edge of the repair kind of blends into the rest of the wall, and it's not such a definite line. If you're doing just one little repair, then you probably will want to do it in a pan and knife, but I happen to have an entire mansion full of these, so I was going with bucket mud. With the hard mud, I was mixing up buckets of 90. With the light mud, I just mixed up the entire box. But if you're just doing a tiny repair, mix it in a pan. Don't try mixing it in don't mix up a whole bucket, obviously, for a little tiny repair. So like I said, I had a whole mansion. The whole room had cracks. The whole ceiling looked like a road map. Suspected water damage from the chimney above this, which bled down. This is the first floor. The second floor also had that wall was damaged, and as it gets lower, the damage gets worse. This one, I think, tracked across the ceiling. So it's time to put on the stilts and take care of all the repairs in the room. So probably the worst job when it comes to cracks is sanding. I just use a sanding sponge. Sanding sticks sometimes, but with this specific job, like I said, the walls are not flat, so a sanding sponge just goes a little bit quicker for me. Grinding your edges really good. And one thing that's important to remember, which a lot of guys don't do, is once you're done sanding, take a tile sponge and wipe down the surface and get all the excess dust. Once you do that, you're going to find that since it was over paint, you're probably going to have a lot of bubbles, a lot of pock marks, which will need to be filled, because even if you paint it, paint will not fill those. You'll see all those little tiny bubbles, and it'll be a completely obvious telltale point that there was a repair there. So take your box mud, your light mud, pan and knife, fill in every one of those little bubbles. Sometimes they need to be scraped and filled the second time. It is very stubborn, it is very tedious, it is very annoying. Make sure you have a good audiobook, especially if you have a whole mansion full of these, which I did. Once you've gotten that far, make sure you clean it really well. With 100-year-old textures, sometimes I'll use a texture called hand palm, which is done with the hard mud, and you go over it and you basically take a sponge, and it's rough and random, and you just sand the edges. This is, like I said, prepped for a spray texture. So once the whole job is like this, the whole house is getting sprayed to kind of even it out. But if it's just a spot repair, 100-year-old mansion, sometimes that's a trick that works too, and there's no need for the box mud. Also, if you've never done this before, just know that dust is super fine. It is horrible. Make sure you wear a mask, and also isolate the space. If it's tiny, you don't necessarily need to worry about it too much, but if it's a big repair over a super expensive Persian rug or a grand piano or something like that, make sure you spend a little bit of time and cover as much as you can. It's a lot easier to cover than it is to clean that dust out of everything. Keep an eye out for obvious things like cold air returns on furnaces. Sometimes an open window on one side of the house will suck all the dust through the house. Just another thing to keep in mind, that you might need to seal off the area. If it's your house, not that big of a deal because you're going to be the one dealing with it, but if you're working on a very big, expensive mansion like this place, if you get dust all over the house, they will scream at you. You've been warned. Hope this helps. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer any of them that I can without seeing the repairs. and I'll talk to you guys next time.